Hey friends, I'm really excited to present to y'all theologian Dr. John M. Perkins. John is a civil rights activist, an author, speaker, teacher, businessman, and minister. But the long list of accomplishments and accolades only hint at the inspiring and challenging life that has formed his theology. John M. Perkins was born in 1930 into a family of sharecroppers in New Hebron, Mississippi. When John was only 7 months old, his mother died of a preventable nutritional deficiency. She literally starved to death because they were so poor. John would have died himself if it hadn't been for a neighboring sharecropper who gave the family just enough milk to keep him fed. Around that time, his father left, and John and his four brothers and sisters originally went to live with their grandma Perkins. But she was a widow who had raised 19 children herself, and she couldn't afford to care and provide for all five children. John, the youngest, and his oldest brother Clyde stayed with her. At the time, anywhere from 13 to 15 different family members of different generations were living in a 3-bedroom sharecropper's cabin on a property owned by a white farmer. They were unable to make ends meet with the amount of money that sharecropping provided, and so they also were bootleggers of moonshine. John and his cousins and siblings only attended school 3 months out of the year when there was no farm work to be done. And so John only has the formal education equivalent to third grade. In 1946, John's oldest brother Clyde was murdered by a deputy marshal when he tried to resist an unprovoked beating. His family was concerned about John's safety after Clyde's death, and so several months later, they saved up money to send him west. He left on a train for California with only a change of clothes, a lunch, and $3 in his pocket. But life in California did improve for him. He had a strong work ethic and leadership skills, and he was very successful in business. John became skilled at organizing others, and he actually led other workers to unionize and fight for fair working conditions and better compensation. John says it wasn't until California that he ever had a positive interaction with a white person. In 1949, John returned to Mississippi for the funeral of his sister who was murdered. And while he was there visiting family, he met Vera Mae Buckley. John and Vera Mae instantly fell for each other, and the two became engaged before John returned to California. They exchanged letters until 1951 when they got married, right before John shipped off to Okinawa. It was the Korean War and he had been drafted, and so he left for war and Vera Mae stayed in Mississippi to wait for him. After his service in the Army, John and Vera Mae set about building a life together in California. They both got jobs, they bought a small house, and they began to have children. During this time, John was introduced to Christianity for the first time. He'd been around churches but hadn't been interested. But when his son began attending a Bible study, John encountered the gospel in a way he'd never seen before, embodied in Christians who zealously cared for others and who actively sought to embody justice. And this experience transformed his life. John threw himself into ministry with all of the passion that he had applied to his business endeavors. He became involved in evangelism, first to children and then to adults. And he began to form relationships for the first time with white Christians who didn't use their faith as a reason to oppress others. He began organizing and speaking at youth camps, leading prison ministries, serving as a chaplain, and even started an association for other Christian businessmen. He spent all of his free time with his family in ministry. But God began working on his heart. And though he had vowed never to return to Mississippi, that's exactly what God was convicting him to do. Convicting him that he and his family should return to Mississippi to serve in ministry there and to be a catalyst for spiritual, moral, and economic transformation. He began recruiting support, including financial pledges from other Christians, from Black Christians and white Christians who were passionate about seeing the gospel brought to rural, segregated Mississippi in the interest of transformation. However, convincing others to pledge their money was far easier than convincing his wife. Verame was very afraid of what returning to Mississippi would mean for their family, especially with the reputation that John's family had. And so she resisted, but after a mysterious ailment in which doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong with John, she decided that that must have been a sign from God that she needed to trust him more. And so after Verame agreed, they began plans to move back to Mississippi. In June of 1960, 6 months after their fifth child was born, they returned to Mississippi to begin ministry there. John threw himself into ministry in Mississippi much as he had in Pasadena. He launched Bible classes at public schools. He began serving as the chaplain of a local black junior college, the Prentice Institute, teaching Bible classes to adults, arranging tent meetings, planting a church, and building and administering a Bible institute. He was involved in nearly every type of community development you can imagine, even helping to build a new public black school. As the civil rights movements of the late 1960s gained momentum, John's faith compelled him into civic action. He began working to provide voter education and registration, attended rallies for civil rights, and spoke at black and white churches alike about the need for the evangelical Christian church to be a part of the civil rights movement. But unfortunately, he was met with a lot of resistance from white and black churches alike. He began expanding his work, starting leadership training to build up and empower the young black men and women of their county to not only seek education, but to return and participate in the grassroots movements to rebuild black communities in the South. He became passionately involved in the economic development of communities, convinced that economic cooperatives would help break the cycle of economic dependence that kept rural, mostly black poor, enslaved to an exploitative economic system. However, the stakes rose in 1970 after rural Mississippi became racially integrated. His family received threats from the KKK, and he was nearly beat up by the county sheriff, or nearly beat to death by county sheriffs and the highway patrol after he had led the black community of Mendenhall to oppose police brutality. It's too detailed of a story to fully share here, but after a bad encounter with local police that resulted in John and another man being beaten and charged with allegations of contributing to delinquency of minors, the white city and county officials and the law enforcement were enraged and humiliated. John led the whole town in an economic boycott during the week of Christmas as a means of protesting these unfair arrests and beatings of black men. And this week-long boycott actually turned into months-long tension between white and black communities, especially with the county sheriffs and the state highway patrol. They kept up the economic boycott, but they also began having weekly marches where anywhere from 100 to 200 people would march down to the city hall that housed the jail and demand equal rights for black men and women. Eventually, the State Highway Patrol staged an ambush by arresting a van full of college students after one of these Sunday evening marches. And when John and two other pastors crossed into the next county to go to the jail and ask what was going on, they were arrested and they were severely beaten throughout the night. In fact, it was a wonder that all three survived because they nearly didn't. The horrific accounts of the torture and abuse that they suffered at the hands of the officers deeply impacted them. Even after they were finally released and began to heal physically, the psychological abuse continued as these law enforcement officers would threaten them daily, driving by their houses, waving guns at them. This experience and the police brutality, but also the two trials that followed, and the way that they revealed how deeply complicit the legal system was with the treatment of black men and women. And this had a profound effect on the black community and on John and his family. The trials ended up in appeals all the way up to the state Supreme Court. And though they didn't win, they did count it as some form of justice because the Black community got to see a Black man leave the courtroom free. Even though he was convicted, he didn't serve any time because they pled it down to a lesser charge. They also got to see a Black female lawyer in court for the first time. During this time, John suffered a heart attack. John suffered from a heart attack and then had to have 2/3 of his stomach removed because of ulcers. And while he was recovering, he realized that much of his life and ministry had been motivated by fear. He was overwhelmed with love and forgiveness for his white oppressors and became convinced that if he didn't change something, he would be overtaken by hate the way that they had been. He came to recognize that all of us, not just white America and not just the white church, are in need of lament and forgiveness and repentance. Now, this was by no means the end of John's work. He continued engaging in evangelism, in missions, in leadership development, community development, and reconciliation. In 1982, he and Vera Mae returned to Pasadena, California to embody their convictions about social justice and urban transformation by intentionally placing themselves in a downtrodden community in Pasadena that was known for drug addiction. He is the President Emeritus of the John and Vera Mae Perkins Foundation and a co-founder of the Christian Community Association. He's been awarded honorary doctorates from multiple colleges and partnered with Seattle Pacific University to launch the Perkins Center for Community Development for Reconciliation, Leadership, Training, and Community Development. He's also served on the boards for World Vision, Prison Fellowship, and other well-known nonprofits and councils. John's theology, which is characterized by the necessity of embodying the gospel tangibly, allows us to see resistance to empire in so many different facets, such as economic systems of capitalism and consumerism, and systems that sustain economic disparity, as well as systems of injustice with regards to voter suppression and our education system. Of course, we can't help but notice how relevant John's theology is to the cultural moment we find ourselves in today. The racism that is the gasoline poured on the problem of police brutality in our country is something that John's theology allows us to see a church's response of resistance to the imperial values that inflame that problem. John's theology also leads us to a resistance of American privilege. His perspective is wider than just the American church after traveling to Africa for missions. And so while he does say we need to recognize white privilege, we also need to recognize that as part of the global church, we have an American privilege that needs to be resisted. The area in which John's theology offers the most impact is what it offers to the church. John's theology highlights how resistance to empire, in order to truly embody the gospel revealed in Jesus, will necessitate resistance within and sometimes to the church itself. It's important to note that John didn't become a Christian at Black churches in Mississippi because of the way that they were shaped by spiritual comfort instead of true freedom found in Christ. And he didn't become a Christian at white churches in Mississippi because they used their faith to justify racism and oppression. He claims he didn't hear the gospel preached in those churches ever, and that he couldn't see how the Black Christians in Mississippi were any better off than he was without Jesus. I'll finish with a final quote from John himself. The problem is that there is a gaping hole in our gospel. We have preached a gospel that leaves us believing that we can be reconciled to God, but not reconciled to our Christian brothers and sisters who don't look like us. Brothers and sisters with whom we are in fact blood. This sums up well how John's theology not only compels embodied transformation and persistent practice of reconciliation, but also a theology of resistance to empire can encompass such a wide variety of different aspects of empire, because he truly saw the need for reconciliation in every facet of life. Here are some resources I invite you to look at. John has authored multiple books and helped co-author others. There's a great video about him on YouTube, but also there's a lot of his speaking engagements on